Welcome to this edition of Thought to Action, presented by the Herb London Center for Policy Research. I'm Chris Cordani. If you enjoy our content, don't forget to hit that like button, also comment, share, and subscribe. To enjoy sneak previews of our videos, exclusive content, and more special programming in the works, join our Patreon page. It's patreon.com/thoughttoaction. As a subscriber, you'll also have access to our Ask Us Anything sessions, where we at the London Center answer your questions. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Getter, and our website, londoncenter.org. President Joe Biden, as well as high-ranking Democrat influencers, floated the idea of adding extra justices to the Supreme Court to force a political agenda. You might remember this radical idea from such presidents as Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Still, while we're used to 9 justices, the fact is that number has been set when Ulysses Grant was president. Previously, the High Court's population has been manipulated to somewhere between 5 and 10. On this edition of Thought to Action, our panel explores the idea of officially establishing the current number of justices to continue being set to 9, perhaps considering a constitutional amendment, closing the nation's highest court to potential court packing by power-hungry politicians. Also, the current fight against the filibuster comes into play. Our panelists are London Center for Policy Research President Lieutenant Colonel retired Tony Shaffer, London Center Senior Fellow Lieutenant Colonel retired British Army Tim Wilson, London Center Distinguished Fellow Navy Captain retired Pete O'Brien, Keep 9 Coalition Executive Director Roman Buehler, and former Tennessee Attorney General and Keep 9 Coalition Chairman Paul Summers. Gentlemen, let's start here. Talk of changing the number of Supreme Court justices is not new, but has gained traction in recent years. While the Keep 9 Coalition wants a constitutional amendment to preserve the current number, why hasn't this happened already? And how vulnerable really is the nation's high court to packing, considering it really hasn't been done yet?
We believe that the threat is greater than at any time since 1937. For the last 150 years, there's been a tradition that the court should remain at 9. But a new generation of progressives have decided that checks and balances on the abuse of power are not as important as achieving the short-term political gains that they could get from turning the court into their political puppet. And the other factor is that another check and balance on the abuse of power, the Senate filibuster, is under attack. And last week, we saw Democrats use really unprecedented rhetoric. They accused people who opposed the filibuster of siding with pro-slavery Civil War era figures. And why did they do that? And the answer is because they wanted to bludgeon every Democrat in the Senate, except for Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, into submission. And they succeeded in that goal. And so now every Democrat in the Senate and almost every major Democratic candidate around the country for Senate is committed to getting rid of the filibuster the next time the Democrats have a majority. And the one thing I think people don't appreciate is that Democrats win majorities, even supermajorities, on a regular basis. And as the Wall Street Journal suggested, the Democrats are playing the long game. The next time they get a majority, a lot of people think their plan is to get rid of the filibuster, add some new states so they have bigger majority in the Senate, and then pack the court. And because it's possible, a lot of ambitious politicians are eager to do it.
Roman, I have to ask, I mean, you talk about when they get a majority, and I know historically that will happen. Getting a majority of senators, for example, though, is not the same as getting a majority of the country behind them. And there is a strong view that this is, once again, the politics, if you like, of a bullying minority driving through things that are not good for the country. I think an awful lot of American citizens have the common sense to understand that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And a lot more have an understanding that Murphy's Law plays in, and there's a law of unintended consequences that should they get their way and do away with the filibuster, the reaction to it at some stage could be strong enough that they end up deeply regretting it ever happened. Isn't that the whole aim of following the constitutional line, as it were, and historical precedent, is to avoid the type of deep conflicts that could result from them, this minority, this progressive minority getting their way?
You are absolutely right. But the history of this quote progressive minority is pretty discouraging, right? We heard a lot of promises about you can keep your health care, period. And regardless of the fact that it was unpopular, the progressives went ahead and did it. You can go back to '94, and they had to carry a Democratic member of Congress crying down the aisle to cast the decisive vote for Clinton's tax increases. When Democrats have an opportunity to advance their agenda, a lot of times they'll do it because even if they lose the next election, they think that in the long term they will gain. And gaming this out, I think they will probably do it. If it happens, it will probably happen in the first year of a new Democratic president's term, because then they'll have 3 years to divert the voters to think about something else before the Republicans would have a chance to win and reverse the action. And I can't understand why anybody would want to destroy one of the fundamental advantages that the American system has, which is an independent court, no matter what the political gains. But unfortunately, that's not the world we live in.
Well, Ramon and Paul, I have a question for both of you then. I'm not sure if I'm considered an originalist or not, but I do believe the dispersion of power and checks and balances is the key to the republic. And I'm one of those who believes that we should return the election of senators to each state's legislature, not to allow direct voting on that. So maybe I'm a bit old-fashioned, but I do believe that represents better the 10th Amendment intent by giving states a more clear ability to justify who they send forward. So I'm also a believer that the system currently is set up to benefit the progressives in overwhelming the system. So in my judgment, the number of justices is not so as important as the actual personality of the individuals who become justices. Sotomayor, some of the other justices I see as activists. They do not interpret law that is before them. They attempt to shape it. I think that's very dangerous. So within the context of what I think we all would agree the intent of the founding fathers was to limit the ability of power to be consolidated for purposes of overwhelming the republic. Are you both proposing a constitutional amendment, a constitutional convention? How would you go about trying to ensure and enshrine that we can capture a reasonable number of justices and most importantly, prevent the progressive rabble from being able to overwhelm? Because our side, the conservative side, doesn't seem to be as aggressive and effective as the left. So how do we go about trying to establish mechanisms to protect our own side's inability to do things to preserve and protect the republic?
Great observations. In 1789, when our Constitution was ratified, our founding fathers created 3 branches of government. 2 of those branches were completely political: the executive branch and the congressional or the legislative branch. The 3rd branch was intentionally made non-political. Now, it takes a political appointment, but then once someone is appointed and confirmed, then that job is completely non-political. Judges, and I've been one, judges they wear black robes to make decisions on the constitutionality of questions or on the law, not based on policies or politics or political persuasion. The reason that the Supreme Court and the judiciary generally is independent and is because our forefathers had the wisdom. Number one, they wanted to make it independent and not politically oriented. Number 2, they knew that judges need to follow the rule of law. That is, everybody's created equal and everybody is endowed with certain inalienable rights, such as life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. But most importantly, the judiciary is the checks and balances on abuse of power, primarily from the other 2 branches. If we destroy that by, quote, packing the court, and all it has to be done, the Constitution is silent on the number, All it has to be done is to increase the number. So what happens if the Democrats, for example, increase the number of Supreme Court justices? In about 10 years, when the Republicans are in charge, what are they going to do? The next thing, you know, as you may have said, Dan, at some Thanksgiving dinner, some child is going to ask his or her granddaddy, why do we have 54 members of the United States Supreme Court? We don't want that. To answer your question specifically, we're proposing a constitutional amendment, which is a firewall against court packing by a bipartisan group of lawyers and former attorneys general. A bipartisan group supports this to have the Supreme Court set at 9, which has been for 153 years, about 2/3 of our constitutional republic.
All these are great arguments. I agree with everything that's been said so far. The point that I think that needs to be made is that there is a gap here, and the gap is, if you will, the civics knowledge of the average American today, which has been eroded due to, I guess you can just throw it out there, is poor education. And I think it's important to understand, for folks to recognize, and obviously you do, sir, is that the founding fathers didn't come up with this system simply because it sounded good. They didn't come up with this because it was passed down, it was carried from heaven by some angel. There are hard lessons behind the idea of limiting government. There are hard lessons behind the idea that power needs to be, if you will, diced up and not concentrated. And there was goodness, if you will, again, more hard lessons learned with the idea of making government processes slow and to some extent cumbersome. We don't want a legislature that can pass a law just like that, and we don't want them to be able to put a case before the courts and get an answer before lunch. There is method to it, and the method is 6,000 years of recorded history that says, I want change slowly when a government has their hands on the tiller, and I want that change to be deliberate, and I want it to be clear, and I want it to be in front of all the people. And so when you start doing things like making let's add 1,000 congressmen to the process, let's add 100 judges to the process. What you're doing is fundamentally you're stepping on 6,000 years of history that say you need to make those kind of changes very slowly, very deliberately, and in many cases you come upon an answer that's working. You take that answer and you safeguard it. And the way you safeguard in our system is you make an amendment that says this is going to be this, and we're not going to mess with it. And if you want to mess with it, you can go back and change the Constitution again. But that's a very slow, hard process, and it's deliberately so. And I think the real issue here is that we need to educate the average citizen that says, hey, when the Washington Post says they aren't acting fast enough in Congress, the right answer should be, no, we don't want them acting fast enough in Congress. We want it slow, we want it painful, we want it clear, we want them to go over it page by page. You don't pass a bill when you haven't read it. You only pass a bill after you've debated it. You don't bring something into the courts and it goes immediately up to the Supreme Court. You work through the system and you make sure it's a good problem set, and you make sure that the judges all want to discuss that issue, and we work through it slowly and deliberately so that we don't get it wrong.
You know, you raise a very important point, which is the key to all of this is the education of the American people. And we are extraordinarily fortunate on this issue that the American people already understand the concept of court packing. We've had several polls taken which show 3-to-1 support. When you ask voters, would you support a constitutional amendment that says the Supreme Court of the United States shall be composed of 9 justices, by 3-to-1, 64-to-17 in the latest polls, voters are with us. What they don't know yet is that there is an amendment out there which would make that permanent. And our job is to educate the people who already agree with us that the Supreme Court should be 9 justices and it should be in the Constitution, that there is an amendment, and that it's an amendment that's backed by 200 members of Congress. It would be the shortest amendment in the history of the Constitution. And very important for a lot of voters, it was first introduced by a Democrat. This is not a partisan thing. This is a bipartisan thing. And in a world where the parties want to divide and fight with each other, this is an example of how people of goodwill in both parties are working together to try to get something done for the good of the American people.
Well, Ramon, speaking to a former member of Congress from the left over the weekend, even the progressive left is divided in their own house regarding how to handle this. And I know there's conscientious, I would say, traditional liberals that who are understanding that the need to maintain liberal democracy, and I use the small L liberal word. But it seems to me that you have a committed part of the left who's willing to burn the house down to establish essentially one party rule. How do we overcome that?
Well, I think the key is that the left is, if you remember the Wizard of Oz, you know, he was behind the curtain and it sounded like the great, the great wizard. But when you ripped away the curtain, it was this little guy. And when you look at the left, our polling shows that about 27% of Democrats, this is not voters, only 17% of voters, only 27% of Democrats oppose the idea of an amendment. So there is this very small minority that wants to hijack the Democratic Party and hijack the American political process to get their goals. And if we can expose them for the tiny minority that they are, and mobilize the great bipartisan majority that, while it disagrees on many things, they agree on one big thing. They don't trust politicians. And they certainly don't want the Supreme Court to become a puppet of politicians. So in our effort, for example, one of our most exciting groups is a young group called Progressives for Keep 9. These are kids, most of them who supported Bernie Sanders. And they agree with Bernie Sanders, who said, I wouldn't pack the court because I'm afraid the Republicans might do it. And if we can mobilize that bipartisan support, which would include almost all people on the center and the right, and a good chunk of people on the left, and an overwhelming majority of people in the middle, I think we can put enough pressure on politicians so that in the end, they're forced to adopt the amendment. And frankly, that's the way women's right to vote happened. That's the way presidential term limits happened, and we can do it again.
Roman, you mentioned the long game, and you mentioned the filibuster. This is something the Democrats have been playing for a little while, at least the establishment Democrats. Talk about how that comes into play when it comes to their movement to try to pack the Supreme Court.
Well, if you look, and you're historians here, and so you understand history. If you look at the history of the last 100 years, there have been 4 times when the left has won a supermajority where they could do anything they wanted. Right? Wilson, they gave us the income tax. Roosevelt, they gave us Social Security, but unfortunately no way to pay for it. Then Johnson, they gave us Medicare, the same thing. Sounds good, but no way to pay for it. And then Obamacare. So the Democrats now have a plan for the next time they win a supermajority. And it's not going to be a policy. They've learned. Their goal is to rig the system so that they never lose an election, to nationalize elections so they can micromanage the rules for vote counting and vote casting in their favor, to micromanage redistricting so they can do it in their favor, to clear the path for getting rid of the Electoral College. So they have a plan, and all their plan requires is that they wait until the tides of politics give them another majority. And, if you live on the beach in Florida, all you have to do is wait, and you're pretty much guaranteed a hurricane. And so the left strategy is to be prepared so that when they, I don't know if you live these movies, right? You watch The Lion King, and remember the bad guys do the whole thing of be prepared when the bad event happens. Well, the left is getting ready. So the next time they win a majority, they get rid of the filibuster, add new states, pack the court, rig the system, and they think they'll be in charge forever. Now, no one's ever in charge forever, but they could do a lot of damage. And that's our problem. And the fundamental change in thinking that advocates of limited government across the political spectrum need to think about is it's not about winning elections. Winning elections is important for short term, but in the long term, we need to think about structural reform that strengthens rather than weakens checks and balances. And the great debate, as people look back in 200 years on this era of American politics, if there are people left in 200 years to look back, it'll be the struggle between those who want to destroy checks and balances so that majority can do anything at once. Some people would call that the tyranny of the majority. And the people like us who believe in checks and balances, who believe in constitutional limited government. And I believe the most important fight of our time in that framework is this battle. Can we preserve an independent Supreme Court?
If we're going to start looking at long games, and it's always interesting to look at the opposition and how they're running their game. How do we organize, if you will, the right, or I like to say we're really the center, is that how do we organize us so that we have a list of if you will, amendments that would strengthen the idea of limited government and the sort of the dissipation of power from the center? Do we put in a spending amendment that limits cap spending? Do we send the Senate back to the states, which is I always think is a good idea? How do we go about taking the same long game that every time we, the conservatives in the middle get a supermajority, they also are ready to go.
I think the question you ask is an excellent one. And we at the Keep Nine Coalition are focused very like laser on the Keep Nine Amendment to preserve an independent Supreme Court. But what we want to begin is a conversation where people are asking just what you're asking. If we can prove that it's possible for a bipartisan grassroots movement that says it's time to take power back from politicians and give it back to the people. It's time to take away this destructive power that politicians have to corrupt the Supreme Court. If we can succeed at that goal, then people will begin asking, what else could we do? Could we do a balanced budget amendment that stops the borrowing? Could we do a regulation reform amendment that requires regulations to be approved by Congress? Could we do other different kinds of reforms that curb the abuse of power? Now, personally, I think that anything we do has to meet two big tests. One, it has to empower voters rather than disempower them. And second of all, it has to be something that overwhelming bipartisan majorities of the American public support. I think those are the only kind of reforms that will succeed. But we're not here to tell people what the next reform is. We're here to say that right now, we can have an opportunity to unite people around an amendment that has overwhelming public support. And if we succeed, it could turn, I think, the momentum of politics and government from an era where power was accumulating in Washington and being abused to an era where we were strengthening checks and balances and strengthening our democracy. And I would just say there is no more important protection for democracy. You hear a lot about democracy these days than an independent Supreme Court.
Let me comment also, and going back to the education question, I think it's not only important, but it's imperative that in the next election, which comes in November of 2022, that we have a two-part question that we ask all candidates for Congress and all candidates for the United States Senate. And that is, number one, do you favor or do you not favor court packing? Most of them are going to say, oh, I don't favor court packing. Said, well, if that's the case, then what is your position on the Keep Nine constitutional amendment? If they waffle at all, that means they are for court packing, maybe not now, but in the future. That's so important to have a two-part question, not a one-part question. After all, before she died, Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the Supreme Court said 9 seems to be a pretty good number. Secondly, current Justice Breyer said 9 seems to be a good number, and I'm against court packing. The bottom line is this is a bipartisan effort. When we first got started, back about 2 years ago, there were 15 former attorneys general, all of whom represented their states, most of whom represented their states in the Supreme Court. Of those 15 former attorneys general who understood the system, understood politics, 8 were Democrats, 7 were Republicans. This is a bipartisan issue. This is to protect the third branch, the independent branch of government, which is the crown jewel in our democracy, the crown jewel. Let's protect that crown jewel with the constitutional amendment.
I just want to say one other thing, because this is the title of this program is Thought to Action. And I think a lot of people ask themselves, well, constitutional amendment, great idea, but I can't do anything about that. That's all up to those politicians in Washington. They couldn't be more wrong.
Mm-hmm.
The American Republic, I worked in Congress as a lawyer for 14 years. I was the chief lawyer for Republicans in the House on election law issues. And the American people need to think of politicians not as their bosses, but as their employees. And we are, in fact, as citizens, we are the owners of the American experiment. And it's our job as citizens to get politicians to do things that aren't necessarily in their short-term interest, but are in the long-term interests of the company. Just as the stockholders in a company do that for the employees in a company. And so we suggest that there are 3 things that people can do if they want to be involved in this effort. The first is very simple. They can call their elected representatives, the people they can vote for, their congressman, their senator, their governor, their lieutenant governor, their attorney general, their state legislatures, and the increasing number of politicians who are running around the country telling us that they want to be our next president. And they can ask them a simple question. Are you prepared to endorse the Keep 9 Amendment to preserve an independent Supreme Court? Or is that something that's just a little bit too controversial for you? And we ought to know. We ought to know there are going to be 3 kinds of politicians. There are going to be politicians who say, yes, I'll support it. Politicians who say, no, I won't support it. And then there are going to be the ones like Joe Biden in 2020, who said the voters don't deserve to know where I stand. And we need to know and any citizen can do that with politicians they vote for. The second thing that a person can do is to go out and find friends, find other people who want to be involved, Democrats, Republicans, independents, people who may never have been involved in politics before, who are used to only being involved but when they read some email asking them for money, right? No. Find other people who want to do that same thing, hold politicians accountable. And the third thing that people can do is they can use their power. The power of individual citizens has never been greater because of the internet to spread this idea. Send an email to all your friends saying, I heard about this amendment called the Keep 9 Amendment to ban court packing. It's backed by 200 members of Congress. It was introduced by a Democrat. What do you think of it? To spread the word. And that can be done by email to your friends. It could be done on Twitter if you have a Twitter account. It can be done by writing a letter to the editor of your newspaper or calling in on a talk show or adding a comment after any article that appears on the web. And it's incredible what a group of citizens can do. And so if people want to help, if they want to get involved in this effort, right, they can email us. We respond to every single email we get, leaders@keep9.org. You can go to our website, www.keep9.org for information. But this is about citizens taking their country back.
It seems to me as well that the other side of this doesn't often get asked. Why do you want to increase the number? Why do you want to pack the court? Is the system broken? What's wrong with it? Actually asking people to say what is wrong with the current system usually leaves people waffling, quite frankly. Paul, what happens in courts when people start to waffle?
Well, historically, we've had 9 members on the Supreme Court since 1869. We've had the most we've had was 10, and in 1869 it was reduced to 9, and we've had 9 members of the Supreme Court for the last 153 years. That's almost 2/3 of our constitutional republic since 1789. There's no question about, and I hate to use a Tennessee adage. I'm sure it's an adage probably in Virginia as well, but if it's not broken, don't try to fix it. That's what you're saying, basically, if it's not broken. But the main thing is this: what's going to happen if one party increases the number by a law, a statute passed by the Congress and signed by the president? What's going to happen when the other party's in? We don't want to become a banana republic. We do not want to become a banana republic. We want to maintain what we have and to protect that crown jewel.
If I may,
If it wasn't true, why would a bipartisan group of former AGs gotten together and say this is a good thing?
well, that's part of it, but I would rephrase that question. What benefit is there to one side increasing the number of justices? What benefit?
What they say is, well, we want to prevent we want to prevent the political ideology of the current members of the Supreme Court, which is exactly the reason why you want to have an independent Supreme Court. The exact reason why you want to have an independent Supreme Court. It's all about a short sugar high. A short sugar high. It's not about the long term of our constitutional democratic republic.
That's why it seems to me such a good idea to appoint Bernie Sanders as an independent of the Supreme Court. That way he's independent and they're independent. How about that?
Well, that's an idea.
There is an argument, and we need to be careful, because you see this pop up every now and then, and this is held by the far left, is there are far too many, pardon the dog here, there are far too many, this is their argument, not mine, there are far too many opportunities missed because we have so few justices, and that if we had more justices, I saw one fellow come up with a recommendation for, I think, 53 judges needed to be on the Supreme Court to make it proportional to the current population of the nation, and the idea again being is, you know, it'll be much more rapid. There'll be a lot more things that they could do, and of course, I think the answer we all need to come back with is no. Actually, we don't want the Supreme Court handling lots of stuff. We don't want them setting precedent after precedent after precedent. We want to keep the process. Excuse me. We want to keep the process slow and deliberate.
Well, what they don't understand is we've got 13 federal circuits, and the job of the Supreme Court is primarily to decide issues that are not consistent throughout the circuits of the United States. What people don't understand is, what is the role of the Supreme Court? The role of the Supreme Court is to be the final decision maker when there's a conflict of opinion within the circuits. That's the primary reason. As to original jurisdiction, they have original jurisdiction involving consuls, and also when an issue involves a state versus a state. But most of the decisions that are made in the federal district courts, and all you have to do is pass a law to increase that number. And also in the circuit courts of appeals, pass a law to increase that number. The Supreme Court is to decide disputes when 3 circuits may say one thing and 3 circuits may say another thing. They're to decide those disputes so that it will be consistent throughout the United States. The system has been working well for 153 years. And why do you want to change the system? The reason you want to change the system is because you have because if you pack the court, you'll have a Supreme Court that will make decisions that you favor. There is not a case that goes before the United States Supreme Court that 51% of the people say they are brilliant and 49% of the people say they're absolutely nothing but politicians. Every one of them is controversial. That's nothing new.
So I would just say, one of the challenges that we face is people think, oh, this is just an academic issue. It's but this is an issue, whether we have an independent Supreme Court, affects almost every issue that currently is on the front page of the news. It affects whether or not the government can order people to do certain things for health reasons. It affects our healthcare system. It affects our Second Amendment rights. It affects our free speech rights. It affects whether or not we're going to have fair elections free of election fraud. It affects the rules, whether or not the federal government has the power to regulate without the approval of Congress. It affects all of those issues. And I would suggest that there's one big issue that a lot of people are afraid to talk about, but you're beginning to hear it on the left. The left's goal has always been to confiscate property from those they don't like and give it to their friends. And they have got a proposal, as Elizabeth Warren would say, I've got a plan for that. It's called a wealth tax. And it's probably unconstitutional under the current reading of the Constitution, because the 16th Amendment only authorizes an income tax. But the left likes to talk about the wealth tax as a Robin Hood tax, take from the rich and give to the poor. But what it really is a Sheriff of Nottingham tax, where the government can take anything you own and give it to somebody else. And I think one of the real reasons the left wants to pack the Supreme Court is because their spending plans require vast new sources of revenue. And their goal is to confiscate the savings of Americans and give it to their friends. And unfortunately, some of those proposals are pretty popular. But the reason they can't do it is we have a constitution. And the left wants to destroy the checks and balances in this constitution because they really do have a fundamentally different way that they want to allocate earnings and savings in this country. And I think for people watching this program thinking, how do we stop the left from doing it? You can't stop the left from doing it by winning elections, because sooner or later, the left's going to win an election. And so for people who want to preserve not just our constitutional system of government, but the fundamental ability of people to own and keep the property that they and the resources that they earn, I think the battle to preserve an independent Supreme Court will be, in fact, the decisive engagement of that war.
Well, that leads us to the next question. What's Keep 9 up against? Obviously, there is a lot of support for that, both in Washington, across state legislatures, and the American population. However, as you've noted, there are a lot of very powerful people who want to push an agenda. What are we up against, and how do we defeat them and put together a real Keep 9 amendment?
Let me address that, but let me also go back to a question. Oftentimes it's raised, well, a constitutional amendment is so hard to become ratified. Well, I want to point out that in 1789, we had a constitution that was ratified by our 13 states. Immediately after the Constitution was ratified, 12 amendments were added. 10 of those 12 amendments, which is now called the Bill of Rights, which we talk about more than anything, they were ratified by the states within 2 years. So it's definitely not impossible. It's definitely not impossible. It's a hard job to get something approved by 2/3 of the Congress and then ratified by 3/4 of the states, but it can be done. And I point to you the Bill of Rights, for which we talk about every day. But also, let me say this. We need to make sure that we have a firewall against court packing and to preserve that crown jewel of independence of the Supreme Court and the judiciary as a whole. Ramon?
So you've asked the strategic question, and there are really two things that we have to do that I think, if we accomplish those goals, will inevitably lead to the adoption of the amendment. The first is we have to make the Keep 9 amendment to ban court packing a household word in America. Everybody knows Obamacare. You say the Patriot Act, everybody knows what it is. You say court packing, everybody knows what it is. But you say Keep 9 amendment, nobody knows what it is. So we have to make that well known. And that happens from the bottom up, right? From people like us to the 500,000 or million people who are opinion leaders around the country that shape the opinions of the people they know. And it's one person at a time, and it's one program like this at a time, educating people. And the other way that happens is, look, let's be honest, there are, a dozen or 2 dozen top media people in this country that shape what people watch on television, what they read on the internet. We need to persuade those people that the court packing event is not some small little dumpster fire somewhere. It is a 4-alarm fire. And again, I don't know if any of you saw the Towering Inferno 40 years ago, but everybody ignored the little fire on the first floor up in the penthouse. And, 2 hours later, the whole building was up in smoke. This is that kind of fire. If we don't put it out now, we are going to regret that we did it. The second thing we need to do, besides making Keep 9 a household word, is we've got to build a grassroots network of first hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands of people around the country who are demanding that elected officials tell us where they stand. We don't have to convince people that the Keep 9 Amendment is a good idea. That's already there. We just have to make people aware of it and make people aware of where politicians stand. And if you look at how women fought over 30 years, 50 years, and won the right to vote, and you look at how the civil rights movement fought for many, many years and forced the end of segregation in the South, and you look at these great movements in American history that basically changed our country to a country that was more just, and a better country. We need an effort like that now to preserve an independent Supreme Court. And if we don't, we're going to be very sorry.
The one thing that keeps popping out to me is the fact that you've obviously got a number of former attorney generals, which is important. You have, I think, a good framework for education. The question becomes funding. While I think a lot of folks can get out and look, I personally interact with a number of personalities. One of the first guys I think you ought to talk to, if you haven't already, is Lou Dobbs. Lou, I think, would be all over this. And, I've been on with Lou, and I think there's a handful of conscientious media types who would simply do it. But with that said, the one thing I've learned about the left is that they're well funded. And when they want to, even though they're a small percentage, the amount of money that they have available to them amplifies their point of view by an order of magnitude over their actual size and numbers. Is there any thoughts on how you guys are going to fundraise to overcome their numbers advantage regarding funding?
Well, that's very, very important. And look, there is no shortage of money to be spent on politics. These days, people spend $300 million on a Senate race and $100 million on a race for Congress. What we have to do is persuade people who express their participation in politics by writing checks, that one of the key checks they ought to write is to some organization or group that is supporting the Keep 9 Amendment. And by the way, if somebody's watching and they're thinking, boy, I want to invest, $10 million in there, you don't have to give it to us, right? Hire your son-in-law, right? This is an amendment that anybody can participate in. But our premise is that we're going to spend probably $1 billion to $2 billion on each side in the congressional elections of 22 and double or triple that for the presidential election in 2024. And donors who are investing a huge amount of money for the short-term benefit of having control of Congress ought to think about investing long-term to preserve the independent Supreme Court and to preserve the system that gives them the right to keep their property and to have fair elections. And if somebody is interested in talking about the different options for participating financially, either by giving to us or doing on their own, please email us at leaders@keep9.org. And if any of you know people that you think ought to hear about this, we'd love to be talking to them, because that's our biggest job. Our biggest job is we're the Paul Revere's. We have to let people know that this thing is coming and how to stop it. And then it's up to people, right? America's an independent country because a bunch of farmers got up at 3 o'clock in the morning and went out to face what could be certain death at the hands of the largest military force on the planet at the time, right? We're asking for people, whether it's time that you have, or whether it's resources that you have, or whether it's people that you know, we're asking people to step up and participate in this effort. And again, our email is leaders@keep9.org.
This may sound trivial, but we're talking about the very roots of how this country came together and stayed together. And I would just return to what we talked about earlier is for the folks who are listening out there, particularly for the parents who are listening out there, take this issue up with your kids. Make sure your kids understand what it means to have a limited government and what it means to have the power flow from the people, that the government works for us. It's not too much of a reach to say that when you walk in the room, the congressman should stand up because he's your hireling. And we need to have that, if you will, laid on top of the kids every day. They're not getting it in school. The parents need to take that up and make sure that the kids understand that there's a purpose behind this. It's not just because it sounded like a good idea. It's because history tells us that people are like this and they need limited government, that if you give them too much power, they'll abuse it. And the parents need to carry that message.
Thank you, Captain. Thank you.
Part of that's also referring to our legislators as legislators and not keep calling them leaders, because technically they're not leaders. They're there, as was said several times during this conversation, to do our bidding, to represent the people that they're sent to Washington to take care of. Thank you for being with us for this special edition of Thought to Action, presented by the Herb London Center for Policy Research. Thank you again to Roman Buehler and Paul Summers of the Keep 9 Coalition for joining us for this discussion. Please remember to hit that like button. Feel free to comment, and we want to know what you think about this and other issues. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to our Thought to Action channel and pound the big red bell for updates on future shows. Find out more about the London Center on our website, londoncenter.org. And if you would like to help us continue to create discussions and programming like this, please join us on Patreon, patreon.com/thought-to-action. You can enjoy sneak previews, special exclusive content, and our Ask Us Anything sessions. Also, you can help us greatly by sharing this video with your friends, colleagues, and social networks. That would really be a huge help to us and to the Keep 9 Coalition. For our panel and the Herb London Center for Policy Research, I'm Chris Cordani. Thank you, stay informed, and make your day a great one. Okay.